Atlanta simmered under a blazing sun, its humid air thick with tension. The city had become a focal point for protests against police violence, and every action by law enforcement was scrutinized. Cell phones captured every move, turning routine encounters into viral moments. On this day, what began as a routine patrol would spiral into an event that no one could have predicted. Officer Darren Klein gripped the steering wheel of his cruiser as he sped toward a reported suspicious vehicle in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The call had been clear. Black male in a luxury car, possibly armed. It was the kind of call Darren had grown accustomed to, one that played into his long-held biases. Darren was a veteran officer, known for his aggressive tactics and sharp tongue. While his record officially remained clean, whispers of misconduct had followed him for years. He dismissed such talk as politically correct nonsense, believing he was just doing his job. The cruiser screeched to a halt at the edge of the neighborhood, and Darren's eyes locked on the target, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. The vehicle sat idly in front of a modest home, looking, to Darren, both out of place and out of character for the area. Darren stepped out of his car, his hand instinctively moving to the holster at his hip. "Driver, step out of the vehicle, hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the street. Inside the SUV, Jason Turner's brow furrowed as he glanced at the rearview mirror. He had just ended a work call and was preparing to head inside after a long morning. As the deputy director of the FBI, Jason was no stranger to tense encounters, but this was different. He felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Lowering the window cautiously, Jason revealed his face. His calm demeanor belied the unease simmering beneath. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice level yet firm. Darren's eyes narrowed. The man's calmness only annoyed him further, feeding into his belief that this was just another suspect playing innocent. "Step out of the car, now, hands up!" Darren barked again, taking a step closer. Jason raised his hand slightly, keeping his movements deliberate. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. His years of experience in law enforcement had taught him the fine balance between de-escalation and self-preservation. "I'm cooperating, officer. My name is Jason Turner. I'm a federal agent," Jason said slowly, enunciating each word. Darren scoffed, his grip on the weapon tightening. "Federal agent? Yeah, right, out of the car, don't make me say it again." Jason sighed, scanning his surroundings. A few neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, their phones raised, recording the scene. He noted the growing crowd with a mix of relief and irritation. Relief because witnesses could deter the worst. Irritation because this shouldn't have been happening at all. "My badge is in the breast pocket of my jacket on the passenger seat," Jason said, keeping his hands up. "You're welcome to check it yourself." Darren hesitated, torn between disbelief and the seed of doubt creeping into his mind, but his pride kept him locked in his stance. "You don't move until I say so." Jason's tone sharpened slightly, though he remained outwardly composed. "Officer, I'm following protocol. I suggest you do the same." The words seemed to hit a nerve. Darren stepped closer, his weapon still trained on Jason. He reached into the car with one hand while keeping his gun in the other, fumbling for the badge. When his eyes fell on the embossed letters reading Federal Bureau of Investigation, his face blanched. "You've got to be kidding me," Darren muttered under his breath, though the words carried more panic than anger. Jason lowered his hand slightly, his gaze steady. "No, I'm not kidding. Now, I strongly recommend you lower your weapon before this gets any worse for you." Darren froze. His peripheral vision caught the smartphones recording every moment, every word. The weight of the gun in his hand suddenly felt heavier. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the weapon. "This is just a misunderstanding," Darren stammered, his voice losing its edge. Jason's tone remained firm, but there was a measured patience behind it. "You pulled a gun on a federal agent based on nothing but a vague report. That's more than a misunderstanding. Now I suggest you call your superior officer." Immediately, the silence that followed was deafening. The onlookers murmured among themselves, their cameras still rolling. Darren's jaw clenched, but he fumbled for his radio. The damage was done, and he knew it. Jason stepped back, taking a deep breath as he adjusted his jacket. His years in the field had prepared him for many things, but moments like these always carried a personal sting. He turned to Darren, his voice now quieter, but no less commanding. "This isn't just about you or me, officer. It's about the system that allows moments like this to happen. Think about that. Jason walked away, leaving Darren standing by his patrol car, visibly shaken. The growing crowd didn't disperse. Instead, they continued filming, ensuring that the incident would live far beyond that afternoon. By the time Darren's superior arrived, the story was already spreading. Videos of the encounter began circulating online, with captions decrying another instance of racial profiling gone wrong. Hashtags filled social media, calling for accountability. Within hours, news outlets had picked up the footage, and the pressure mounted on the Atlanta Police Department to respond. Jason, however, wasn't celebrating. He had no interest in turning the incident into a personal victory. For him, it was a painful reminder of the reality faced by countless others who didn't have a badge or a title to protect them. As he sat down in his living room that evening, his phone buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues and media outlets. He ignored them, focusing instead on the quiet hum of the city outside his window. But he knew this wasn't the end. The confrontation with Darren was just the beginning of a larger battle. Jason was determined to use the incident to push for change, even if it meant standing in the crossfire of public opinion. For Darren, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. His name became synonymous with misconduct, and his career hung by a thread as internal investigations began. While some defended his actions as procedural caution, the overwhelming public outcry left little room for redemption. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. The encounter on that quiet street in Atlanta had become a symbol of a much larger issue, one that demanded reckoning, accountability, and above all, change. Jason Turner sat in his office 2 days after the incident, his hands folded on the desk. The walls around him bore framed commendations and photos chronicling his decades-long career, reminders of the battles he'd fought and the barriers he'd overcome. Despite his position, the weight of his experiences hung heavily. This wasn't the first time Jason had been profiled or disrespected because of the color of his skin, but it was perhaps the most egregious. He replayed the encounter in his mind, analyzing Darren's behavior. Jason didn't see a rogue officer acting out of pure malice. Instead, he saw a man operating within a system that rewarded his instincts to judge first and think later. It wasn't an excuse, far from it. But Jason knew that to effect meaningful change, he couldn't just focus on Darren. He had to address the culture that allowed someone like Darren to thrive. Jason glanced at his phone, scrolling through dozens of emails and text messages. Advocacy groups, media outlets, even federal colleagues had reached out, offering support or requesting statements. One message stood out. The mayor of Atlanta had requested a private meeting to discuss the incident and its implications. Jason leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. If the mayor was getting involved, the political stakes were about to rise dramatically. Meanwhile, Darren sat in a small, windowless room at the Atlanta Police Department. His badge and firearm had been confiscated pending the outcome of an internal investigation. A single cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him, growing cold. He stared at the table, his mind racing. The memory of Jason's steady gaze haunted him. It wasn't the look of a man angry or frightened. It was disappointment mixed with authority. Darren didn't know which was worse. The captain entered the room, his face grim. Captain Allen had known Darren for over a decade. While he'd ignored many complaints about Darren's methods, he couldn't overlook this. The evidence was irrefutable, the optics disastrous. "Darren, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything," Allen said, sitting across from him. "You screwed up. Badly. The department's reputation is already in the gutter, and this might be the final nail." "I was following protocol," Darren muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No, you weren't," Allen snapped. "You were following your gut, and your gut got you into this mess. That man you pulled a gun on wasn't just anyone. He's the deputy director of the damn FBI. Do you understand the position you've put us in?" Darren looked up, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know who he was." "That's exactly the problem," Allen shot back. "You didn't bother to find out before pulling your weapon, and now the whole country knows." The captain stood and paced the room. "You're suspended pending review. Don't expect this to blow over." The next day, Jason met with Mayor Christina Evans at City Hall. She was a pragmatic leader, balancing the demands of a diverse and often divided constituency. The incident had put her in an uncomfortable position, caught between calls for reform and pressure from law enforcement unions to protect their own. Jason arrived early, dressed in a crisp suit, his badge clipped to his belt as a silent reminder of who he was. Evans greeted him with a warm handshake, though her expression was serious. "Jason, thank you for coming," she said as they sat in a private conference room. "I'll be honest, this situation is a mess, but it's also an opportunity. We need to address the systemic issues in our police force, and I think your perspective could be invaluable." Jason nodded. "I appreciate that, Mayor, but this can't just be about damage control. If we don't address the root causes, training, accountability, the culture, we'll be having this same conversation again in 6 months. Evans sighed. "You're right, but you know as well as I do that real change takes time, and time is something we don't have right now. The public wants action." Jason leaned forward, his tone firm but measured. "Then we start with transparency. A full public investigation into the incident, mandatory bias training for all officers, and an independent oversight committee to review complaints against the police." "That's a tall order," Evans said, raising an eyebrow. "Change always is," Jason replied. Darren, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues, once quick to defend him, now avoided his gaze. The media coverage was relentless, portraying him as a poster child for everything wrong with modern policing. He barely slept, haunted by the realization that his career might be over. One night, Darren received a call from an old friend, Officer Rick Matheson. Rick was one of the few people who still checked in on Darren, though even his tone carried a note of caution. "Darren, I've known you a long time," Rick said, "and I know you're not a bad guy, but you need to own this. People aren't going to forgive you if you keep making excuses." "I wasn't making excuses," Darren muttered. "Sure sounded like it," Rick replied. "Look, you've got 2 options. You can dig in, blame everyone else, and watch your career crash and burn. Or you can admit you screwed up, learn from it, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to make it right." Darren stayed silent, the weight of Rick's words sinking in. By the end of the week, Jason's efforts had begun to gain traction. The mayor announced a series of reforms, including the creation of the oversight committee Jason had proposed. Public response was mixed. Some praised the steps as overdue, while others dismissed them as superficial. Jason wasn't naive. He knew that changing public perception would be a long and uphill battle. But as he stood in front of reporters during a press conference, his voice was resolute. "This isn't just about one officer or one department," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. That trust has been broken, but it's not beyond repair." Back at his apartment that night, Jason received an unexpected email. It was from Darren. The message was brief and unpolished, but it carried a weight that Jason couldn't ignore. "Mr. Turner, I want to apologize for what happened. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it. I realize now that my actions were wrong, and I'm willing to listen if you're willing to talk. Darren Klein." Jason stared at the screen, a mix of emotions washing over him. He didn't know if Darren's words were genuine or just a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. But part of Jason believed that if he truly wanted change, it couldn't come without dialogue, even with those who had wronged him. Jason stared at Darren's email for several minutes. His emotions conflicted. His instincts as a law enforcement officer urged caution. Was this a sincere olive branch or a calculated move? But the part of him that had endured countless injustices and fought for systemic change knew that dialogue, however difficult, was essential. He typed a brief response, arranging a meeting in a neutral setting. 2 days later, Jason and Darren met in a small, private conference room at a community center in downtown Atlanta. The room was sparse, with a simple table and 2 chairs. Darren arrived first, fidgeting with a coffee cup, his demeanor tense. When Jason entered, his presence immediately filled the room. Darren stood awkwardly, unsure whether to offer a handshake. Jason made the decision for him, nodding curtly and sitting down. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Darren started, his voice uncertain. Jason's expression remained neutral. "I'm here to listen. Say what you need to say." Darren took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. I want to start by apologizing. What I did was wrong. I made assumptions about you, about the situation, that I shouldn't have, and I let my emotions control my actions. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I needed to say it." Jason studied him, searching for signs of sincerity. Darren's body language was stiff, his gaze shifting occasionally, but there was no arrogance, no deflection. "You made more than a mistake, Officer Klein," Jason said evenly. "You endangered my life because you couldn't see past your biases. Do you understand the gravity of that?" Darren nodded quickly. "I do. And I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything. I've spent the last few weeks questioning everything. How I approach my job, how I was trained, and what I believed was normal. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was." Jason leaned back, arms crossed. "Why now? Why reach out after everything that's happened?" Darren hesitated, his voice quieter. "Because I can't live with myself if I don't try to make this right. And because I've seen what this system does, not just to people like you, but to officers like me. It turns us into something we're not supposed to be. But I let it happen. That's on me." Jason let the words hang in the air, weighing their authenticity. Darren's apology felt raw, unpolished, but genuine. It wasn't enough to erase the harm, but it was a start. "I appreciate you taking responsibility," Jason finally said. "But words alone won't change anything. If you want to make this right, it'll take action, real action." Darren nodded earnestly. "What can I do?" Jason's tone was firm but not unkind. "You can start by speaking out. Share your story. Talk about what led you to act the way you did and what you've learned from it. It won't be easy and you'll face backlash, but it's the only way to begin earning back trust." Darren swallowed hard, the weight of Jason's suggestion sinking in. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." In the weeks that followed, Darren's suspension turned into a resignation. He began attending public forums, speaking openly about his experience and the systemic flaws in law enforcement training. At first, his appearances were met with skepticism, sometimes even hostility. But over time, as he shared his story with unflinching honesty, people began to listen. Jason, meanwhile, continued his work with the mayor's office and local advocacy groups. The oversight committee he'd championed was established, and mandatory bias training for officers became a priority. Jason knew these measures were just the beginning, but they were significant steps toward lasting change. One night, Jason was invited to speak at a community forum alongside Darren. The room was packed with people eager to hear their perspectives. As Darren recounted the events of that day and the introspection that followed, the room was silent. "I was wrong," Darren admitted, his voice steady. "I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I know I can't undo what I did, but I can choose to do better. And I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." When Jason's turn came, he addressed the audience with the same calm authority he'd shown that day in Atlanta. "What happened between me and Officer Klein wasn't an isolated incident," Jason said. "It was a symptom of a much larger issue, a system that fosters mistrust, fear, and division. But I believe change is possible. It starts with accountability, openness, and a willingness to confront hard truths. We can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge." The audience erupted in applause, but Jason and Darren exchanged only a brief nod. They both knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but that night marked a turning point, for both of them and for the city of Atlanta. The video of Darren and Jason's joint forum quickly went viral. Public reaction was mixed. Some lauded their efforts as a beacon of hope, while others dismissed it as a public relations stunt. Jason wasn't surprised. He knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Darren, however, faced a harsher reality. Despite his attempts to take accountability, he became a target for both sides of the debate. Former colleagues ostracized him, labeling him a traitor, while some activists questioned his sincerity. Darren struggled with the backlash but remained committed to his path. Jason kept a watchful eye on Darren's progress, occasionally reaching out to offer guidance. While he remained cautious, he couldn't deny the courage it took for Darren to step into the spotlight and face his own failings. As months passed, Jason saw signs of progress in the department and the community. Complaints of misconduct began to decrease, and public trust in the police started to recover. It was slow, incremental change, but it was real. For Darren, the journey was one of redemption and transformation. He joined an advocacy group working to reform police practices, using his experience as a cautionary tale. His relationship with Jason evolved into a cautious partnership, two men from opposite sides of a broken system working toward a common goal. Their story became a symbol of what was possible when accountability, humility, and resilience met. It was a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged, and that change, while difficult, was not beyond reach. Months after the incident, the encounter between Jason Turner and Darren Klein continued to echo throughout Atlanta. Their paths had diverged, yet they remained linked by the shared weight of that day. Jason had risen as a key figure in the push for systemic reform, while Darren struggled to rebuild his life and understand the biases that had defined much of his career. Jason spent his days immersed in the complex work of reform. His position as deputy director of the FBI had afforded him a national platform, and he used it to spotlight the systemic issues that led to incidents like the one he'd endured. He spearheaded efforts to establish an independent oversight board for the Atlanta Police Department, introduce mandatory bias training, and increase transparency in police misconduct investigations. For Jason, these measures were just the beginning, a foundation for deeper, lasting changes. Meanwhile, Darren faced the fallout from his actions. After resigning from the department under public scrutiny, he found himself grappling with an identity crisis. His career, once a source of pride, now felt like a symbol of failure. Darren's days were marked by long hours of reflection and outreach, seeking guidance from community leaders and former colleagues who had chosen paths of accountability. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of the damage caused by his biases, not just to Jason, but to countless others he'd encountered during his years on the force. The turning point came when Darren reached out to Jason directly. His email was brief but heartfelt. "Mr. Turner, I want to apologize for what happened. I understand that words aren't enough, but I needed to take the first step. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and listen. I need to learn how to make things right. Darren Klein." Jason hesitated before responding. He'd seen countless apologies, many of them performative or insincere, but something in Darren's tone felt different. Jason agreed to meet, choosing a neutral location, a small community center downtown. When they sat down across from each other, the tension in the room was palpable. Darren was visibly nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup, while Jason maintained his usual calm demeanor. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Darren began, his voice uncertain. Jason's response was measured. "I'm here to listen. What do you have to say?" Darren took a deep breath, the weight of his guilt evident. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I made assumptions about you, about the situation that I shouldn't have. I let my prejudices guide my actions, and I nearly caused something irreversible. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to take responsibility." Jason studied Darren for a moment, searching for sincerity in his words. "You endangered my life because you couldn't see past your biases," he said bluntly. "Do you understand the gravity of that?" "I do," Darren replied, his voice steady but pained. "And I know that an apology isn't enough. That's why I want to do more. I'm ready to make this right, whatever that means." Jason leaned forward, his tone firm. "If you're serious, you'll need to act. Speak out about what you did, what you've learned, and what needs to change. It won't be easy. You'll face backlash, but it's the only way forward." Darren nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. "I'll do it." Darren followed through on his promise, becoming a vocal advocate for police reform. He started attending public forums, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned. His speeches were raw and unpolished, but they resonated with audiences because of their honesty. Darren didn't shy away from admitting his faults, and that vulnerability began to shift public perception. Jason, meanwhile, continued his work at the policy level. He collaborated with local lawmakers and community leaders to ensure the reforms he'd pushed for were implemented effectively. The Oversight Board began reviewing cases of police misconduct, and bias training sessions became mandatory for all officers in the department. One of the most significant moments came when Jason invited Darren to speak at a citywide summit on policing and community relations. The event brought together activists, police officers, and lawmakers, and Darren's presence was met with mixed reactions. Some saw him as a symbol of change, while others viewed him as irredeemable. During his speech, Darren addressed the skepticism directly. "I know many of you don't trust me," he said, "and I don't blame you. Trust isn't given, it's earned. All I can do is show, through my actions, that I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for the communities I failed to protect." The room was silent as Darren spoke, his words carrying the weight of genuine remorse. Jason followed, delivering a powerful speech about the importance of accountability and the need for systemic change. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," Jason said. "It's about dismantling the culture that allows moments like this to happen. Change is hard, and it's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. We can't afford to look away any longer." Months later, Jason was invited to Washington, D.C., to oversee a federal initiative on nationwide police reform. The program sought to replicate the successes in Atlanta on a larger scale, focusing on transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Accepting the position meant leaving Atlanta, but Jason knew the fight for justice required him to think beyond his city. Before leaving, Jason met Darren one last time. They sat on a park bench overlooking the city, the skyline glowing under the setting sun. "I hear D.C. is calling you," Darren said with a faint smile. Jason nodded. "It's an opportunity I can't pass up, but Atlanta's work isn't done, and neither is yours." "I won't let up," Darren promised. Jason extended his hand, and Darren shook it firmly. Their relationship, once defined by conflict, had transformed into a partnership driven by shared purpose. Jason left for D.C., where his work continued to shape national policies. Darren remained in Atlanta, dedicating himself to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. Their story became a symbol of what was possible when accountability and dialogue met determination and growth. Jason Turner's move to Washington, D.C. opened new doors to tackle systemic issues on a national scale. As the architect of a groundbreaking federal initiative, his days were filled with meetings, policy drafting, and coordinating efforts with police departments and community leaders across the country. Yet, despite his growing influence, Jason never lost sight of where his mission began, on a quiet street in Atlanta, facing the barrel of a gun held by a man who had judged him before knowing anything about him. Back in Atlanta, Darren Klein's journey of redemption was still unfolding. His resignation from the police force had not been the end of his career, but the beginning of a transformation. Now a full-time advocate for police reform, Darren's work brought him to community meetings, public forums, and police training academies. He spoke candidly about his past mistakes, refusing to shy away from the consequences of his actions. "It's not enough to say you're sorry," Darren often said in his speeches. "Accountability starts with owning your failures, but it doesn't end there. You have to put in the work to make things right, not just for yourself, but for the people you've hurt and the system you've upheld." Darren's willingness to confront his past head-on made him a polarizing figure. Some officers viewed him as a traitor, while others quietly admired his courage. Members of the community who had suffered from police misconduct were understandably skeptical, but over time, Darren's consistency began to earn their trust. He didn't make excuses, and he didn't seek praise. His actions were proof of his commitment to change. Meanwhile, Jason's influence in Washington was yielding results. His federal oversight initiative was adopted by multiple states, creating standardized protocols for police accountability. Civilian oversight boards became mandatory in several jurisdictions, and data on officer misconduct was made publicly accessible for the first time in many regions. While these changes didn't solve every problem, they represented significant progress. The relationship between Jason and Darren evolved during this period. While they were not close friends, they maintained an open line of communication. Darren frequently sought Jason's advice on navigating the challenges of advocacy work, while Jason appreciated Darren's unique perspective as someone who had been part of the system but was now working to change it. Their collaboration was a quiet but powerful reminder that bridges could be built between even the most unlikely individuals. Years passed, and Atlanta became a case study in successful police reform. The city's oversight board, once viewed as a bureaucratic hurdle, became a respected institution, known for its transparency and effectiveness. Reports of misconduct dropped steadily, and while trust between law enforcement and the community was not perfect, it had improved significantly. Jason's work took him to cities across the country, but Atlanta always held a special place in his heart. He visited frequently, both to see the progress firsthand and to reconnect with the people who had helped him start this journey. One warm afternoon, Jason received a handwritten letter from Darren. The envelope was simple, the handwriting slightly uneven. "Jason, it's been a long road, but I wanted to thank you. Not just for holding me accountable, but for showing me that accountability doesn't have to end with shame. It can be the start of something better. You gave me the chance to make amends, and I'll never forget that. The work isn't over, but I'm committed to it. Darren. Jason folded the letter carefully, placing it in the same desk drawer where he kept other mementos from his career. It was a small but poignant reminder of the impact one moment, one choice could have. For Darren, the journey continued. He was now a key figure in local reform efforts, working closely with community leaders and police officials to ensure the next generation of officers approached their roles with empathy and understanding. Darren's name still evoked mixed reactions, but he had learned to live with that. His focus was on the future, not on seeking universal approval. The story of Jason Turner and Darren Klein is a powerful testament to the complexities of change. It highlights that accountability, while painful, is an essential step toward progress. But their journey also serves as a challenge to all of us, to confront the systems we operate within, to question the biases we carry, and to take meaningful action to address injustice. For law enforcement, this means rethinking the very foundations of the profession. Training must prioritize de-escalation and community engagement over fear-based tactics. Accountability must be enforced through transparent oversight, not shielded by silence or bureaucracy. Officers like Darren Klein, who confront their failures and choose to work for reform, should be supported, not ostracized. For communities, it means continuing to hold institutions accountable, while also fostering dialogue and understanding. Change cannot come solely from the top down. It requires grassroots efforts, advocacy, and persistence from those directly affected by the system's flaws. For individuals, the story asks a deeply personal question. What role will you play? Will you remain a bystander? Or will you engage in the difficult but necessary work of pushing for a better, fairer world? The encounter between Jason and Darren could have ended in tragedy, like so many others before it. But instead it became the catalyst for a journey of growth, redemption, and systemic change. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was proof that even in the most fractured systems, progress is possible when individuals are willing to face uncomfortable truths. Now the question is, what will you do to contribute to this ongoing journey? Will you challenge the status quo? Will you demand accountability from those in power? Will you examine your own biases and take steps to overcome them? Change doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a single step, a single choice. Jason Turner and Darren Klein's story is a reminder that the path forward is often messy and difficult, but it's also necessary and worth fighting for. Their journey doesn't have to be an isolated story. It can be a blueprint for how we approach justice, accountability, and redemption in our own lives and communities. The question is, will you take that first step?